One of my latest subscriptions was to a YouTuber by the name of CogentCanine, and despite the strong disagreements I'm about to have with him in this video, I intend to stay subscribed to his channel because overall I think he does make good videos. However, this video stood out to me. It's called Shoe on the Other Foot. It stood out to me because of how relatively poorly thought out it was, at least in my opinion. In this video, he criticizes anti-feminists for inexplicably becoming MRAs, and for using bad statistics. Now, before I get to my disagreements with CogentCanine, I wanted to take a minute to explain some of my disagreements with MRAs, if only as a show of good faith, but also to see if we can find some common ground. First, I do agree that anti-feminists and MRAs misuse stats and ignore relevant factors. And yes, sadly, even the self-proclaimed skeptic community does this, and I'm sure I'm no king among men on this front either. One example of ignoring relevant factors that stands out in my mind is the famous feminist hoax paper that got published. The paper itself was gibberish, and it was just laced with feminist buzzwords, but otherwise made no coherent sense. And anti-feminists loved that it had been published in a feminist journal. But, as with any research paper, it depends where it was published. This particular paper was actually rejected by a relatively respected journal in feminist academia, but then it was published in a much less respected one. That's not really a victory. Bad journals publish bad articles all the time, but many anti-feminists and MRAs ignored that. Another bad faith claim, in my opinion, is the often cited fact that women live longer than men. Now, this is true, but what MRAs always fail to mention is that this happens across the animal kingdom, and that this seems to be a side effect of testosterone, either as a direct chemical interaction or as a result of the behaviors it encourages. So, I'm sorry, MRAs, but this fact, by itself, does not prove that men are being given the short end of the stick by society. Holding up this statistic as evidence of oppression or just hardship is, I would say, as ignorant as the argument that women are paid 77% of what men are paid. It looks at a raw number with no consideration of why it might be. You could argue that this difference in lifespan is caused by the extremely high proportion of workplace fatalities that are men. Not that I've often heard these two things connected, but let's talk about that. Like the previous fact, this is statistically true. An extremely high proportion of workplace deaths are male. Most figures show it as being well above 90%. The thing is, men are choosing to work these jobs, so what's really the problem here? If you want to say that the wage gap is largely caused by the choices women make, then you can't turn around and speak about workplace fatalities as if men aren't choosing to work in these dangerous environments. So now that we've seen some of my major disagreements with MRAs, let's get on to the video by CogentCanine.
1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will be victims of physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime.
And then after this, she gets the feminist's opinion on this.
On the whole issue of domestic violence. That's just another word, really. It's a cleanup word about wife beating. And it's not girls that are beating up on boys. It's boys that are beating up on girls.
And this is why feminism is a joke.
But how did being anti-feminist correlate to being pro-MRA? If we say, hey, feminists, you're acting really stupid. Society's pretty fair all around for everybody. Stop whining, complaining, and bitching like social justice warriors. We then don't get a fucking turn around and go, oh yeah, these MRAs are saying a lot of interesting good stuff. No, they're not. They're saying all the same bullshit that men have been saying forever. And so are women.
So the question was, how did being anti-feminist correlate to being pro-MRA?
But how did being anti-feminist correlate to being pro-MRA?
I'd say that this happened for 2 reasons. Number 1, MRAs often bring up facts and statistics about men and women that happen to be inconvenient for feminists, and anti-feminists are more than happy to take those bits of information on board, which creates a kind of de facto alliance. And number 2, in doing so, anti-feminists have been shown a whole new realm of men's issues, which is shocking at a humanitarian level. I had no idea there was so much suffering all around me. Imagine if you just learned yesterday that there are millions of starving children in Africa, having never heard about it before. Oh, it would be horrific. You'd be shaken to your core about it. But because, for most of us, it seems like people have always been starving in Africa, we don't really care that much. It's not shocking anymore. The wound is not fresh. But when people hear about men's issues, it's usually for the first time, And when those people are not feminists, they're much more likely to accept these as real issues and to care about them. I think the specific issue of domestic violence does make it clear why anti-feminists and MRAs tend to fall into this kind of de facto alliance. If you so much as acknowledge that men are abused as well, in non-trivial amounts, the whole feminist narrative that domestic violence is caused by patriarchy crumbles. So if it can be shown that men are also abused in non-trivial amounts, that fact will appeal to both MRAs and anti-feminists. And this is why I bring up these types of statistics in some of my videos. I don't bring them up because I consider myself an MRA, which I don't, and I don't bring them up because I'm really passionate about male victims. I bring them up because they are inconvenient for feminism. Sorry if that makes me sound like an MRA, but I can't help it. The enemy of my enemy, as they say.
But to favor men's rights activism over women's rights activism, when you actually look at the fucking stats, if there were ever to be an activism for a sex, it would clearly be women. They are clearly taken advantage of more than men all across the world. And yes, we are fortunate enough to live in a free society where women have all the same rights we do. That's why we say it's stupid to have third-wave feminism.
I don't think I've heard many, if any, MRAs or anti-feminists say that non-Western countries like Saudi Arabia and Egypt don't need feminism, at least in terms of the classic equality under the law type of feminism. It seems to me that you're just putting words into your opponent's mouths and then equating non-Western countries to countries like the United States in order to make the men's rights movement seem unnecessary.
Third-wave feminism seeks to alter society's structure to be more accommodating to women. It says that we need to teach young women about science so they go into scientific fields, because right now they're not. And it's because we're just not pushing them to do so. If we just taught little girls to be scientists, there would be more girl scientists. That's third-wave feminism. That's what third-wave feminism seeks to do.
Yes, and the MRAs I've listened to tend not to buy into this idea that everything is a social construct, and they're more than willing to provide sources to support their disagreements. Indeed, many of the sources I used in my Feminist Counter Theory series were originally brought to my attention by MRAs, which I think further highlights the practical de facto alliance between anti-feminists and MRAs.
Now, the MRAs have a lot in common with third-wave feminism. Men are pretty goddamn well off. The laws that are in place are really not that discriminatory towards men.
Well, except for circumcision in law, alimony in practice, child custody in practice but sometimes in law, Title IX in practice, affirmative action in law, affirmative consent on college campuses, paternity testing, I bring this up because it's actually illegal in France unless the court orders it, and legal paternal surrender in law.
The laws that are in place are really not that discriminatory towards men. The best arguments I could give for MRAs would be childhood custody. But even there are reasons why the mom has custody over the kid from the beginning. They're not doing blood tests, so they know beyond a shadow of a doubt that that woman popping out the baby is the mother of that kid. That is the main reason why we give women the benefit of the doubt when it comes to custody, is because they're attached to the fucking kid.
Are you retarded? I'm sorry. That's just the question that pops into my head every time I watch this part of the video. Do you really think that courts are awarding custody to mothers because they know it's hers, but they have no way of knowing that it's also his? First of all, in the age of DNA tests, the mother is no more attached to the child than the father is, at least in terms of knowing if it's your kid or not. Or, if this really is the reason why courts favor mothers, then maybe paternity tests should be required, which, incidentally, is something MRAs support. And second, if his name is listed on the birth certificate, most courts will use that to conclude that he is the legal father. Now, interestingly enough, when it comes to making a father pay child support, his name being on the birth certificate can actually overrule the fact that the child isn't biologically his, even if the mother wrote his name without his knowledge because she needed to put some name on the certificate. So which is it, Canine? Why, when it comes to child support, do we get to say that it's definitely his, even when we know it's not, but when it comes to actually seeing your child, well, we don't really know it's his child, gotta give it to the mother. It's statements like this that make me understand what MRAs mean when they complain about men not having parental rights, just parental responsibilities.
So we don't need men's rights activists. We no longer need feminism, third wave feminism, that is. Feminism is still needed all across the world. So if you're anti-feminist for the whole world, you're just fucking stupid and you just follow buzzwords and you don't actually understand what it means to think globally or about any other people besides Americans.
As I said, most, if not all, anti-feminists would agree that women tend to get the short end of the stick in many places around the world, and that this is wrong. I'm sorry, but who are these anti-feminists you're so mad at? I've never met them.
This whole anti-feminist thing has become very annoying to me, even though I despise third wave feminism, even though I've had to sit through women's rights classes where they pretty much sat there and told me I'm a disgusting white male, cisgendered pig that doesn't deserve a seat at the table. Even though I went through that and that was annoying, I can still understand that the solution, or to counteract feminism, we don't then advocate for men's rights.
In theory, I agree with you. Advocating for one group doesn't seem like it should disenfranchise another group, so why would MRAs and anti-feminists be so closely related? Well, on top of what I've already said, I think this happens because, in practice, the actions of third-wave feminists often trample the rights of men, so if you're a men's rights activist, your goals will happen to line up with anti-feminists, and vice versa. As one example, take the current moral panic surrounding rape on college campuses, and the affirmative consent policies that have been enacted as a result. As an anti-feminist, I oppose these policies because they make no logical sense given how humans interact with each other in sexual situations. Likewise, an MRA might oppose these policies because they notice that the victims are almost always men, and because the victims will continue to be mostly men because usually the man is expected to be the initiator in romantic interactions. As another example, take shared parenting laws. Shared parenting laws basically require that the default custody arrangement should be a 50-50 split between both parents, unless of course there is evidence that one parent is clearly unfit or otherwise not in a position to care for the children. This would help alleviate unfair and biased custody rulings that largely impact divorced fathers. Incidentally, the National Organization for Women, the largest feminist organization in the United States, has always opposed this legislation. Gee, I wonder why MRAs don't like feminism.
And let's take a closer look at this statistic. 1 in 3 women are physically abused by their intimate partners, and 1 in 4 men are physically abused by their partners. Now, when you just look at that stat right there, that seems pretty damning, doesn't it? That almost seems like there's a bunch of women across the US kicking the shit out of their husbands, doesn't it? Well, no, not really. Your common sense intuitions about men being able to kick the shit out of women are still correct. That is still what is commonly happening throughout the world and in the US, is a man inside of a relationship kicking the shit out of a woman. That is still the general fucking trend, people.
Do you have a source for that? The one link in your video description says 1 in 4 women and 1 in 7 men have been victims of severe physical violence by an intimate partner in their lifetime. So, sure, by your one source, in cases of severe domestic violence, there are about twice as many female victims as male victims. But 1 in 7 is not quite as small as you seem to think it is, especially given the relative lack of resources for abused men. Also, from the Intimate Partner Violence Survey referenced in your one source, approximately 2.7% of women and 2.0% of men experienced severe physical violence in the 12 months preceding the survey. So it's not exactly clear that women are far outpacing men as victims of severe domestic violence. And before you argue that these men should just overpower the women attacking them, 1. Women are much more likely to use weapons or poison because they know they're physically weaker. 2. Men know that the police will take her side if they see that she's injured. And 3. Men don't want to hurt their wives, just as abused wives often don't want to hurt their husbands. So-called battered wife syndrome is equal opportunity.
So let's take a look at what they qualify as domestic abuse. Physical violence, aka domestic violence, is the intentional use of physical force with the potential for causing death, disability, injury, or harm. Physical violence includes but is not limited to scratching, pushing, throwing, grabbing, biting, choking, shaking, aggressive hair pulling, slapping, punching, hitting, burning, use of a weapon and use of restraints, or one's body size or strength against another person. So like holding someone down, something of that nature. Now, when the definition for physical violence is set at this, now we can start to see why 1 in 4 men have been physically abused by their intimate partners. When I think of intimate partner physical violence, I think of like knocking someone to the fucking ground. You can't leave the house or you'll catch the back of my hand. That's the type of physical violence I picture in my head when I think of domestic violence. Now, I think these stats, 1 in 4 men, is pretty misleading, and I think without giving the caveats or the context as to what it means by physical violence, then you're just kind of left assuming that it's equal as far as men and women goes. Who is beat up more?
Yeah, I can agree that this is misleading. I don't really have a problem with this analysis. I do think that the better numbers to present would be 1 in 4 for women and 1 in 7 for men.
Well, let me tell you that women are killed at a much higher rate.
Well, twice the rate. Something tells me that's not the much higher rate you had in mind, and I don't think that it's unreasonable for MRAs to advocate for more resources for abused men, since, based on the numbers we've seen, we should have about half as many men's shelters and resources as we do for women. But we don't. That's not fair. Not that I myself am an MRA, and not that I've actually done anything about this problem, but I don't think it's unreasonable for a group of people to be looking out for the men in these situations when they have so few resources.
They go to the hospital at a much higher rate.
Again, true, but not as true as you seem to believe. It's also interesting to note, the most injuries occur when the violence is reciprocal, which makes sense. When two people keep trying to one-up each other, someone's going to end up hurt, and yes, it's usually the woman. But, given that 70% of non-reciprocally violent relationships involve the woman as the sole aggressor, I have to wonder how many of these women simply bit off more than they could chew, how many of them picked a fight with a man who was bigger than them and didn't know when to quit or leave. In fact, this was the discovery that made Erin Pitsey infamous in feminist circles. Most of the women who came to her women's shelter were just as abusive as the men they left. They just couldn't keep raising the stakes because they were physically weaker, which is why they ended up in her shelter. And of course, this goes against the feminist idea of patriarchy as the cause of domestic violence, so anti-feminists like myself are more than happy to align ourselves with MRAs on topics like this.
They say that they fear for their lives at a much higher rate.
I haven't seen any data on this, and CogentCanine hasn't presented any, but suffice it to say, feeling scared doesn't prove that you have any good reason to feel that way. Maybe women are just better at seeing potential risks than men are, and thus they tend to be more scared of them.
So when you hear 1 in 3 women and 1 in 4 men will experience domestic violence or physical violence in an intimate relationship, what you should remember is that the 1 out of every 3 women could have literally been knocked to the ground and sent to the fucking hospital, and the 1 out of every 4 men could have literally got a scratch on his arm.
Okay, sure, by the definitions given, it could be, but by the numbers on severe violence, I think it's pretty clear that this exaggeration is not accurate.
The fact that we separate men and women when it comes to combat sports. But you're going to tell me that a bunch of women are instilling fear into their husbands all across the nation in the same way that men can to their wives?
Not in the same way, but to the same effect. Nothing about female biology prevents women from grabbing a knife and killing you in your sleep, or poisoning your coffee, or running you down with her car. I don't know about you, CogentCanine, but if I was playing tackle football against a team of women who had knives, or poison, I'd feel pretty scared. I think it's also worth noting that if a woman does these things to her husband, most people's first reaction is to give her the benefit of the doubt, and to conclude that he must have driven her to do it, somehow. I don't know about you, but if I knew that my wife was trying to hurt me, I would be extra scared if she knew that she could get away with it.
Now, I really hate how the skeptic community, if you want to call it that, has perpetuated this lie or this myth out there that men's domestic violence is on the rise. Domestic violence against men is on the rise. Well, actually, overall, domestic violence has gone down over the last 30 years. And it's not some epidemic. It's not something that we need men's rights activists for.
Given the relative lack of resources for abused men, I don't see how you could possibly make this claim.
Nor do we need third-wave feminism. So if you're gonna call yourself anti-feminist, but you're also gonna be on board with MRAs, then you must describe to me why the arguments for MRAs are better than that of feminists. But I really think you're going to have a hard time doing that.
I think we should let the audience decide.